Welcome back to Fast Market on the TD Ameritrade Network. I'm Tom White, joined by my co-host Kevin Hinks. But let's bring in our next guest, and that's going to be Andy Swan, the co-founder of LikeFolio.com. Thanks for joining us today, Andy. Hey, so we're talking airlines. They've had a pretty good month here, Andy, a little bit of a rebound, but they're well off of their highs, most of them, that we saw earlier in the spring. What kind of data are you guys seeing out of LikeFolio ahead of Delta's earnings and just a sentiment across the board for the airlines?
Yeah, you got to be careful with Delta. You know, this is a stock that's the week of earnings, the last three quarters has been down by at least 4.5% in each of those, full week periods. So this has been a sell the news kind of stock for a while now. But I will say, at LikeFolio, we're starting to see some real glimmers of hope in the airline industry. Most notably, when we look at people talking about returning to flying as part of their employment or for work. We see steady increases in that, still not to, pre-pandemic levels. But when you have something like Omicron, dominating headlines, pretty much everyone getting sick, and you still continue to see this type of growth and demand, it really tells me that at least for a portion of the country, a sizable portion of the country, there is a let's move on type of attitude that is starting to prevail, around the country. And so I think it's really important to understand that the demand is starting to come back. Now, the biggest problem that airlines have is on the supply side, because so many of their employees, whether it's pilots, ground crew, flight crew, are getting sick as this wave kind of goes across the country, and it's grounding a lot of flights. It's creating a lot of cancellations, a lot of major delays, which really results in unhappy consumers. So, we see that across the board in the airline industry. Every one of these companies' consumer happiness levels at LikeFolio has taken a major hit over the last little while, but the top players remain the same. The top, the ones that make consumers the most happy, or in this case, the least unhappy, are still Southwest and Delta. And so we still see those two as the ones most likely to emerge from this trough as the winners. And so, overall, I think that the supply shock side of things is going to be short-lived, and we're really, really optimistic given the rising levels of demand, especially in people talking about it for work purposes.
Andy, the TSA numbers were strong over the holiday period, but they've dropped off considerably here, as with all the headlines that everyone knows and can see. The question is, and as you know, Andy, you cover airlines a lot. They're volatile in normal times, right? Yeah. I mean, not in these incredible times. So, with this stock has been $33. It's been $46 over the last 3 months. So it can really move. And, the year-over-year numbers are probably going to be pretty good in terms of, bounce back from a year ago. So that's probably going to be okay. But isn't this really going to be, in your opinion, how they guide towards the next 6 months? Is really going to be how this stock moves coming out of this. And I think there's a chance it can really move. And so that's why I think their guidance, that three-headed monster, right? Some of the numbers are going to be good, but they're coming off bad comps. But how they guide going forward is really going to be the key here, correct?
Oh yeah, and I honestly don't know how they can have a ton of clarity in their guidance. So I think if you're really looking for enormously positive guidance out of Delta Airlines, you're probably going to be disappointed. I think, based on our data, there's reason to be positive. There's reason for them to be optimistic, but airline company CEOs, these guys don't like to go too far out on a limb, generally speaking. And, especially after the last, 24 months of what they've been through. And so I think they'll be hesitant to kind of sound the all clear, especially when a lot of their flights are being canceled each and every day. But I do think, if we look longer term, that this earnings volatility may give longer-term investors that, especially if you focus on the top names in terms of consumer happiness, may give longer-term investors an opportunity to say, hey, now I can start to see, or at least I think I can, what life is like, in the new normal or back to normal or whatever you want to call it. And maybe that's a little closer than we think, given the headlines. And if that's true, what does Delta, what does Southwest Airlines stock look like 9 months or a year from now? Because again, this is a company that sold off on earnings many times in the past. And so you've got to have that at least possibility in your mind as a trader in the short term.
Hallelujah, Andy. Getting back to normal and getting past this, the fear that a lot of people have put into this pandemic and the COVID outbreaks, I think that return to normal is going to come soon because everybody's exhausted with a lot of the media coverage on this and the overhype. But if you take a look at your data, the consumer happiness, I get. It doesn't seem like anybody's on social media, touting the airlines for having great service or anything. And I know those are really low compared to your historicals that we've seen, over the last 2 years, or maybe not this past year, but the year before in 2019. But if you take a look at this, and that consumer happiness lagging right under the 50 level. But on the other side, you've got, travel mentions for work starting to ramp up, and expectations are really starting to ramp up. I just don't see that coming to fruition. Do you see any hiccups in that since the Omicron's come into play here, where businesses just aren't going to get back to those levels that we saw in the latter stages of 2019?
Well, no, I think you're right. I think that it's probably overly optimistic to expect to get back to those levels. What I like to see, though, is that steady quarter-over-quarter growth in the demand, that people have, the desire that people have to want to do that. It doesn't mean that it will be permitted by all employers. It doesn't mean that, everybody's going to sound the alarm, but I think small businesses are leading the way here. Large corporations are much more conservative in the way that they apply these policies, but small businesses leading the way. We're starting to see more and more people talk about traveling for work, especially entrepreneurs, very small businesses trying to get ahead of the competition. And so when you see that, eventually it has a market-wide pin action type of effect. And so, from a investor perspective, it's significantly better than seeing, traveling for work mentions completely flatlined or declining at this point in the game. So there is some reason for optimism, but I agree with you. I don't think we're getting back to 2019 levels anytime, super soon.
Yeah, and Andy, just to clarify, your thoughts here and your data points on Delta heading into these earnings. Are you guys, what kind of score do you guys have? Positive, negative, neutral on this ahead of earnings?
Yeah, barely positive because, like Kevin said, the comps were pretty easy versus last year, but guidance is a big problem. And again, I just want to reiterate, this is a stock that 3 out of the last 3 quarters has moved down by about 5% in the week of earnings. So you've got to be careful. You've got to be risk defined. I'll leave it to you guys to help investors and traders figure out how to do that, but definitely worth heeding some caution going into this one.
All right, great stuff. As always, Andy, thanks for all the data points from LikeFolio.
Thank you.
All right, that's Andy Swan, the co-founder of LikeFolio.com.